The year 1776 has particular significance to citizens of the United States. It also has particular significance to students of philosophy. It's the year David Hume died. And some might think that the latter event may be an even more memorable one, for Hume is surely one of the most, if not the most influential philosopher to have written in the English language. He's a central figure in that extraordinary achievement referred to as the Scottish Enlightenment, that period roughly between 1700 and 1850, in which Scottish schools of medicine and law had pride of place, when the architecture of Robert Adam and James Playfair, the philosophies of Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, Adam Smith, Thomas Reid, and Dougal Stewart, the medical accomplishments of William Hunter, Robert Witt, Charles Bell, and William Cullen, the paintings of Raeburn, the poetry of Burns, need I go on? This was a period of great flourishing in art and scholarship and science in Scotland, in Edinburgh particularly, which itself was regarded by the residents as the Athens of the North. Now, Hume may have given some attention to the study of law initially. His maternal grandfather, Sir David Falconer, was, after all, president of the College of Justice. But as Hume tells us in his autobiography, the ruling passion of his life was literature, and that of his mind, philosophy, such that he, quote, found an insurmountable aversion to everything but the pursuit of philosophy, close quote. Even as his family believed that he was studying major works of law, says Hume, quote, Cicero and Virgil were the authors which I was secretly devouring, close quote. Hume's 5-volume History of England was published between 1752 and 1764 and would ultimately make him financially comfortable. It's still a worthy source, all the better for the exceptional literary style of its author. He was a correspondent with some of the major intellectual figures of the time. He housed the troubled Rousseau for a period of time. He'd make his way to the salons of France. His treatise of human nature was conceived and developed during a 3-year hiatus in Paris, that is between 1734 and 1737, only, as he says, to fall dead-born when published in 1739. It remains, however, among the most influential treatises of the past 2 centuries in philosophy. There would be another several years in Paris later in his life as secretary to the ambassador to Paris. And on this tour, he was a veritable celebrity of the salons. He was a great conversationalist, somewhat corpulent as it happens, and as the women of the salon were finding his conversation irresistible, the rather svelte and perhaps envious Frenchmen were sometimes overheard to whisper, and the word was made flesh. Well, Hume was a man of great generosity of spirit, a skeptic who would give philosophy a good name for being advanced by so good a man. Now, as with so many of his contemporaries, Hume was well and widely read in Stoic philosophy. He conducted himself in many ways according to Stoic teaching. The famous hours surrounding his own death give us a David Hume who is noble, fully in control of himself, sensitive to the feelings of those around him. The full 3-volume treatise of human nature appeared in 1739 and, as noted by Hume, attracted very little attention. The work of a man not quite 30 years old, it could not compete for attention with treatises advanced by a handful of truly remarkable Scottish philosophers. Hume himself would later regard it as a somewhat immature work, but it was in fact profound in its implications. He would later refine his philosophy, make it more widely accessible, and publish it in 1751 as An Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals. His philosophical fame rests chiefly on this work and on the treatise of 1739. Now, David Hume is routinely cast in histories of philosophy as the great skeptic. He's similarly and often angrily charged with that by his contemporaries. He seems to be an enemy of the faith. He seems to be somebody turning over all of the tables on which our most confident epistemology depends. But Hume himself set out in his philosophy actually to defeat skepticism, to put knowledge on a firm foundation. He has in mind not causing trouble, but creating clarity by replacing what he takes to be utter speculation dominant in previous writers with something different, namely the right understanding of human nature. This is made unmistakably clear in the full title of the treatise of 1739. Here's the title: A Treatise of Human Nature, being an attempt to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects. So how does he earn the reputation that he has as a skeptic? What is it that he develops that makes him so controversial a figure? In the acknowledgement page of the treatise of 1739, Hume notes the important contributions of, quote, my Lord Shaftesbury and Bernard Mandeville and Dr. Hutcheson, close quote. Now, who are these people? Well, there is a long and indeed uninterrupted tradition in British philosophy, sometimes referred to collectively now as British sentimentalist moral philosophers, and Francis Hutcheson is one of its early proponents. But one might also trace it to Calvin's institutes, especially on the matter of God-given natural instincts. So it's useful here to begin with Francis Hutcheson, 1694 to 1746, because he was the major opponent of a number of principles that Hume would come to defend. Hutcheson was the leading philosopher at Glasgow, Adam Smith being one of his students. He was among the first professors to lecture in English, and his lectures on moral philosophy drew the best and the brightest of a very good enrollment. Against Hobbes's nearly morose perspective on human nature, impelled by hedonistic drives and seeking little more than security against a violent death, Hutcheson defended a theory of the moral sense, something innately planted and inclining human beings to act, as he says, for the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers. Now, against Bernard Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, which was published in 1714, which shows how public virtue arises from private vice of those who seek nothing more than personal gain, Hutcheson counters with this, quote, we are led by our moral sense of virtue to judge thus, that in equal degrees of happiness expected to proceed from the action, the virtue is in proportion to the number of persons to whom the happiness shall extend. Inquiry into the origins of our ideas of beauty and virtue is the work in which that passage appears. So for all the differences obtaining between Hutcheson and Hume, there is this much similarity, and it is fundamental. The grounding of morality is human sentiment. That is to say, the moral dimensions of life are not marked out by the productions of abstract rationality. They're marked out by the actual constitutive nature of our being. We are equipped by a providential God, or what Hume rather neutrally refers to as the very constitution of our nature, equipped in such a way as to have certain core sentiments that establish what we value, the sentiment of benevolence, for example. And so what the early part of the British sentimentalist tradition seeks to establish is a kind of naturalized moral theory, not something abstract or transcendental, a gift of the schoolmen, but something very earthy. The moral domain, the domain of values, that which makes anything really count to us, is inextricably bound up with the kinds of beings we are. A person of deep religious conviction will understand this to be a gift of a providential God, who has fitted us out with just what we need by way of a moral temper to do God's bidding in the world. But if that isn't your view, if your religious position is not the foundation of your metaphysics, then indeed you simply take this as a fact of nature, that by the very constitution of our nature, we have certain inclinations and not others. Now, in acknowledging Mandeville and Shaftesbury right at the beginning of the treatise, Hume is identifying himself as someone who is going to strive for an entirely naturalistic account of human nature, something we'll find a grounding for in epistemology and morality. That's going to be the grounding in our own nature. Hutcheson's religious account is beyond the resources that Hume requires for his own treatise. But Hume and Hutcheson will nonetheless establish the basis upon which Adam Smith's own moral and economic philosophies will come to depend. There's a tradition here, and Hume is a central part of it. Now, in Hume's work, the result of this perspective is the view that you simply cannot extricate the particularities of human nature from the claims we make about morality. There will always be the stamp of our perceptual mechanisms, our sentiments, our passions, on any production of ours, including the most vaunted productions of philosophy. Philosophy isn't outside the human condition. It's an expression of the human condition, and you can't get out of that bind at all. An empiricist, Hume is influenced by Bacon, Locke, and Berkeley. Now, the last of these provided the most compelling argument for the proposition that we cannot find a point or place external to perception from which to establish our epistemic claims. Hume, however, will not be caught up in the Berkeleyan dilemma about whether or not anything exists outside the realm of what is perceived. Rather, developing Locke's program, Hume argues that the mind is formed out of sensory experience, that this is where everything begins. It begins at the level of perception. The external world impresses itself on the organs of sense. And out of these sensory impressions, we have either our current sensations, as we actually see what's going on, or recollections of them. By the revival of earlier perceptions, the mind is capable of the act of reflection. This is reflecting on things that have previously happened. But I say these impressions then constitute the basis upon which the mind makes representations of the external world. So what Hume is arguing is that there is some external physical world capable of exciting the senses, but that the contents of the mind are just copies or simulacra of what is occurring at the level of sensation. So what we have then is a theory of knowledge as always mediated. We never have an immediate knowledge of the external world, only the mediated knowledge that comes by way of this intermediary, namely the perceptual or sensory capabilities of a creature that happens to be of the sort we are. You understand then that what's being said is this: you can't know the external world as in itself it really is. You know the external world by way of perceptual mediation. Now, one might see in this skepticism, except I think it's fair to say that Hume, operating out of a naturalistic tradition, is not promoting skepticism. All this is a century before Charles Darwin, but the 18th century is already hosting an essentially Darwinian view on any number of issues. Consider Adam Smith's economic theory, which allows the maximum degree of freedom as the means by which to increase the wealth of nations. Actually, Darwin may well have been moved by his reading of Adam Smith, moved toward his own thinking about natural selection. Hume's, then, is already a quasi-Darwinian worldview. He's quite comfortable with the proposition that the creatures of nature survive in virtue of having the kind of constitution that renders survival more likely. And so, although our knowledge is mediated, this is not to lead to an abject skepticism about our knowledge of the external world. It's simply this. I want to use this phrase. It's to psychologize metaphysics. It's to make the traditional problems of ontology and epistemology, the problem of knowledge itself, moral philosophy, to make these problems into problems to be understood in terms of the peculiarities of human psychology, and more generally, even the psychology of the animal kingdom. So Hume's is not an abject philosophical skepticism, but the naturalization of epistemology and morals. Now, what we discover in Hume is an argument to the effect that our knowledge inevitably reflects our constitution, and that includes certain habitual tendencies of the mind. That is, the mind does have certain operating principles, and therefore all of our knowledge claims are going to be, as it were, infected or colored by, shaped by, the foundational operating principles of mind as such. One of the great triumphs of rationalism is the discovery that every effect has an antecedent cause. Now, Hume is going to acknowledge this is how rationalists have been arguing from a time going back to Plato. This is something we know by rational analysis. Nothing shall come of nothing. It's the very bedrock of religious faith, where God is the cause of all things. And it is the foundation of all the sciences, which are devoted to unearthing what? The causes of things. Now, what is Hume going to do with this core rational principle? Hume is famous for raising questions about the concept of causation, how we ever arrive at the concept of causation. And what I want to make a distinction between here, sometimes lost in secondary literature, is this. I think it's an error in reading Hume, occasioned to some extent by the various ways Hume defends and illustrates the problem, to think that he's dubious about causes. I don't think there's any evidence that Hume was skeptical about there being causes. Hume is concerned about establishing the basis upon which we can have the concept of causation, that is, the basis upon which we could ever know about causes, which is a question rather different from whether events in the external world are caused. On the issue of causation, Hume is concerned to discover the reference of causal attributions, and this turns out to be certain habitual modes of operation of the human mind. So let me pause here to say again, what Hume is doing is psychologizing traditional problems in metaphysics. The reference of causal terms is going to turn out to be something about something taking place, some habit of the human mind. So, starting with Locke's rather diffuse use of the notion of association, Hume develops the very laws of association. He's famous for developing core principles of association to account for how the mind comes to work on the evidence gleaned by the senses. Well, all other things being equal, A becomes associated with B when A and B have been present frequently in experience. That is, repetition is one of the principles of association. Now, all other things being equal, when A and B occur together frequently, A and B become strongly associated. Anytime two events, says Hume, have been, quote, constantly conjoined in experience, any one of them in the future will excite the idea of the other. All other things being equal, events that occur together closely in space and time are more fully and firmly associated, here being the principle of contiguity. Events that share a greater resemblance are more firmly associated. And when events are temporally and physically contiguous, they are more strongly associated. So all other things being equal, when the pattern of occurrences is such that one event reliably precedes and the other event reliably follows, the association is very strong, grounded as it is in cause and effect. Causation, then, is simply what the mind assigns to constantly conjoined experiences. Anytime A and B are constantly conjoined, and A reliably precedes B, it is by virtue of a veritable habit of thought. It's one of the very principles of mind as such, that A just is now regarded as the cause of B. At this point in his writings, Hume pauses to say, almost parenthetically, though it's a phrase that would excite the energies of many of his critics, quote, that anything may be the cause of anything, close quote. Do you see? What does Hume mean by that strange claim? Well, look, he doesn't elaborate on that particular point, but it is quite clear what his meaning is. Suppose we'd been constituted in such a way that we would sample the external world, let's say the senses worked in such a way, or the brain worked in such a way, that we would sample the external world, we would see the external world for a second, and then we'd go off the air, let's say for 4 seconds. We'd come back on the air for a second, we'd go off the air for 4 seconds. Now, can you imagine what our notions of causality would be in that circumstance, where maybe in 1 second you see a pitcher in a baseball game winding up to deliver a pitch, and then you're off the air, and 4 seconds later, 9 people are running around? You would inevitably you'd be led to the conclusion that whenever Smith winds up, 9 people are made to run around. The point Hume wants to make is that the concept of causation is not a recording of something observed in the external world. It is instead an habitual mental process. The determinants of the concept of causality are inherent in our mental operations themselves. He has psychologized the concept of causality. In one famous illustration, he says, "I see before me a table on which there are billiard balls, and one ball moves, and it strikes the other, and the second one moves." He says, quote, "I must own I cannot see some third term betwixt them," close quote. I cannot see some third term betwixt them. I see one ball move. There's a term I see. Ball 2 moves. There's a term. But I don't see causality. So where is the causality? Causality is in that habit of mind that renders causal any reliable anteceding and succeeding event, any constantly conjoined pair of events or multiplicity of events. So you might say that although Hume is not skeptical about causation, he reduces the human understanding of causation to a pattern of reliable experiences, such that we will invent, as it were, causation wherever these spatial, temporal contiguities and cause-effect properties are in the mind, where those terms are satisfied. Now, suppose we walk the highways and byways of the world and we confront some poor fallen figure. Let me make this as graphic as possible. This is the age of making things graphic, isn't it? Well, we find some poor fallen victim in a pool of blood, his pockets emptied. He's sprawled out on the pavement, and there's no sign of life at all. And the question that arises is whether some moral wrong has been perpetrated. We want to get at the ultimate grounding of morality. Well, again, if you use the billiard table example, all you see out there are various objects in space with certain colorations and the like. Now, what then is the moral content of what has taken place? It can't be anything out there. That is, if the same spectacle were looked at by a goose, there would not be some moral judgment brought to bear on it. There are certain events or spectacles or sights or occurrences that excite in us, says Hume, feelings of revulsion. And it is in virtue of exciting such feelings that the event in question comes to be judged as morally wrong. The categories of moral right and wrong are reflections of human dispositions and sentiments. Certain characteristics we have in virtue of our very constitution, our very biological constitution, and history of experience and learning and instruction, finally determine what we will come to call right and wrong. So to this extent, one might say, well, is Hume relativizing morality? That's a large question, fit for Hume's scholarship, and one that takes much greater time than we could possibly devote to it now. It's not so much a relativizing, however, as again I say, a psychologizing of morality. Hume is satisfied that we are sufficiently similar in our basic constitutive principles that he would not be greatly surprised if certain core moral precepts showed up everywhere and anywhere. Although the beneficiary of he is the beneficiary of Cook's voyages. So like many 18th century writers, Hume is aware of the great variety of cultural values among different tribal communities. He knows that even though we may be biologically constituted in very similar ways, the value judgments we reach do depend, to some extent, they are relative to the culture, tribe, and context in which we have membership. So Hume, on the level of morality now, is again psychologizing it, and tying it to the very constitutive principles of our nature. And so the question is, well, given the constitution of our nature, what's the whole point of things? Well, of course, the whole point of our biology and our survival is the maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain. You might think Hobbes is whispering in the background. Morality, then, and politics itself should be looked at as social constructions designed by creatures of a certain kind who, as best as they can, are trying to maximize something. And Hume has a word for what it is we're trying to maximize. He's among the first ever to use it in this sense. What we're trying to maximize is utility. He's among the first, even earlier than Bentham, to use this term as it will come to be used in the philosophy of utilitarianism. Again, is Hume skeptical about morality? Well, he would reject all forms of moral realism, no doubt. But he's not skeptical about morality. Rather, he seeks to show how our constitutive nature brings about moral judgments. The moral world is not out there waiting to be discovered, but within the human frame and shaped by the needs and peculiarities of a certain kind of creature. Well, let's look so far at what Hume has done. He has taken the concept of causation and tied it to certain habitual modes of thought. The concept of morality is now bound up with what the behaviorists might call a conditioning history and certain basic sentimental predispositions. As for reason, Hume contends that in reality it is passion that must rule and reason that must follow. And I think we do have to pause over that notion to redeem Hume from his more energetic critics. What's the sense in which passion should rule reason? Well, the sense is a Darwinian sense. You're in a dark forest, and you hear something growling, a roaring sound, and out of the corner of your eye some large striped thing seems to be looming large. Now, you could sit there and with all of the arts and sciences of logic start doing an essential analysis of the a priori and a posteriori probabilities associated with entities like that actually turning out to be hungry tigers. Or you could, in a manner of speaking, run like the wind. Well, you run rather than reason, because you are fitted out by nature to respond to threats against your very survival, to do what it takes to avoid pain and secure pleasure. The baby does not suck at the breast because it has read books on nutrition, but because it derives nourishment through an activity that is pleasurable. Now, this is the sense in which passion should rule reason. What we have to set out to do, well, what we have to maximize, what bears centrally on our interest as beings of the sort we are, is to behave in such a way as to maximize utilities. And this is at the level of emotional and appetitive and passionate processes, the needs of the body, the needs of life, most insistently recording themselves. Reason then becomes the deliberative means of securing what the appetites and passions require. Now, to the extent that this does not sound controversial, it's because we're all, reluctantly or otherwise, children of Hume's. We certainly believe that the essential functions of government are to be understood chiefly in utilitarian terms. We understand that the world as we know it is a creation of our own mental machinery. We can't get outside the box, that is, the box that includes all possible thoughts we might have. Thus, about God being the cause of all things, well, this is really a kind of mythos or belief system based on the very principles that ground all causal concepts. One cannot by reason or by experience go from the facts of the external world back to an intelligent agent who has brought it about. Belief of this sort is another habitual feature of the human mind. Throughout life, constantly conjoined events are viewed as causally related. Now one comes into a world that seems to be all set up in advance. By inference, by induction, one assumes that an unseen antecedent is responsible, and this is what leads to faith in a providential divinity. There will be more than one Presbyterian minister in Aberdeen and Glasgow and Edinburgh wondering whether anybody should be reading this sort of thing. There is another aspect of Hume's philosophy that should be considered, namely his famous problem of induction. Hume declares that the future is under no obligation to mimic the past, and therefore any inference we make about what will happen in the future based on past experience has no rational warrants. Ah, well, there's a problem of induction that we cannot solve. Causality is in the mind. Morality is somewhere in the pit of the stomach. Belief in God is an habitual mode of thought. Hume was quite a controversial fellow, and you can see why he remains one of the most influential writers in all of philosophy.